All to this intense Ciampi chairs series of conference, and we have been very glad to welcome Edgar Grande as a Ciampi visiting scholars and to have his promises to stay with us also in the future on different occasions. Edgar Grande has been working on several issues that are of central concerns to us, but also in general has been very influential in research on democracies, on civil society, on political participations, on political conflict, about which he has published extensively. He has participated also in the research project in which he collaborated with Hans-Jörg and other on political conflicts in Europe, and knowing the scholars who worked in that project, I think Edgar had a most important role also in the theoretical reflections about the transformations of cleavages. He has been working mainly in Munich and more recently retired from the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, where I had the pleasure to collaborate with him in the, or at least observing the establishment of a very successful institutions, the Center for Civil Society Research, which has followed other departments that in the WZB have been working on social movements and democracy. I think this is just one example about the many academic and research projects that Edgar has contributed to launch and has had a most important role in establishing, both in Germany and at the international level. He will be speaking today about the perspective of civil society in transitions, landscape of civic engagement. He will stay with us still for a few days, but then come back also in December and then in the coming years. He likes Florence and he'll be glad to come back. This afternoon, he will also make a presentation at my classes on democratic theories, and in that case, it will be on another topic that is very central in Edgar's contributions on cosmopolitan democracy, and an important book that he wrote with Ulrich Beck, reflecting on the translation. Potentials, and in particular the potentials for developing democracy at the European Union. Edgar, thanks a lot for being with us, and you have the floor. Then we will have two discussants, Cesar, Guzman, Concha, and Hans-Jörg Trenz, both from Scuola.
This helps. I really feel privileged being here, and I had the opportunity of attending now various of these lectures, the Pizzano conference, and some other events. It's a great place, and it was really inspiring for me. I must admit, having heard David Soskai's lecture and his anecdote on Bourdieu, who on rather short notice changed the topic of his lecture when he was invited to give a lecture in Berlin years ago. I was tempted to change the topic of my lecture as well, in particular in the course of the preparation of my presentation for your class this afternoon. The alternative would have been to speak about Europe as a hypocritical empire. But then I reminded me that I'm not Bourdieu, and I decided to stay with the original title of the lecture, Civil Society in Tradition. I only modified the subtitle, as some of you may realize. I'm speaking about changing landscapes of civic engagement more broadly, and not on political participation more specifically. But this is not a change in the focus, but a broadening of it. Of course, political participation, conventional and unconventional, in my understanding, is part of this civic engagement, and it is infected in the changes I will talk about in more or less the same way as other activities. I think the multiple crises of it doesn't change. Well, no, I will give a no-nonsense lecture, but sometimes such pictures help to build bridges. I think the multiple crises of recent years have made it very clear that civil society is becoming increasingly important. There is no need to explain the importance of civil society, in particular in such a context. I think in order to overcome the major challenges we are facing, especially the ecological transformation, it will be crucial whether and how we succeed in activating and involving civil society. The failure of the present German government has made this perfectly clear, that it is absolutely impossible to introduce such major changes without, from top, without the active involvement of civil society. However, we cannot simply assume that civil society will always live up to such expectations. And in the following, I will argue that civil society, in fact, is in the midst of a profound process of change. This profound change is irreversible, its consequences are open and unclear, and we cannot assume that civil society will emerge stronger from this change. And I will develop this argument now in several steps. I will first introduce different scholarly perspectives on civil society and the change of civil society. I will then briefly define my subject, civil society. I will present the conceptualization of changes in civil society, and I will then introduce driving factors of change. I will describe some of the most important manifestations of this change, and I will conclude by discussing some of the consequences of these developments. My presentation will less be a presentation of empirical findings, it will be rather conceptual. The empirical focus, nevertheless, is on West European countries, although I assume that most of it, to some extent or the other, also holds for North American democracies. I do not pretend that these changes can be observed in the same ways in non-Western democracies, although only a few days ago I found a paper on the topic of my lecture on the case of New Zealand. So there's probably some potential to generalize beyond the European context. In a way, what I try to do is a more or less first effort to summarize some of the research of our Berlin Research Center on civil society research in the first five years. If we look at the literature civil society and social capital and so on, we can more or less find two perspectives. The first perspective, in the first perspective, civil society is a subject of change. Civil society is considered as being the main driving force of progressive societal transformation. There are several strands of literature, radical democratic theory, deliberative democratic theory, theories of radicalized late modernity, and so on, and they all make the same point. It is civil society that matters. Donatella certainly would agree on this, because she is one of the scholars who most importantly contribute to this literature. But there is also in Germany Ulrich Beck and Jürgen Habermas. You find Lefort in France, to mention only a few scholars. Against this background, the second perspective is particularly important. That's in this literature, civil society is the object of change. It's not the driver, but it's in a way driven by some other factors. And if we look at this, the early literature on this, which came up in the 1990s, more or less at the same time when social science research rediscovered the importance of civil society, we found accounts on changes, on far-reaching changes. It's amazing that Robert Putnam in 1993 published his book on civil society in Italy, in which he celebrates the importance of civil society, and 2 years later he published a paper on the decline of civil society in the US, Bowling Alone. He very much paved the way for pessimistic accounts on the development of civil society in Western democracies, which identified a decline of civic engagement, which identified a decline of political parties, and a decline of voting behavior. If you take parties and voting behavior, the work of Peter Mayer and of Michael Wattenberg, for example, are most interesting here. And already in 1985, Klaus Offe published an edited book on the emergence of disorganized capitalism. So these pessimistic accounts are very broad in scope, and they have a quite long tradition. More or less at the same time, we find the emergence of several optimistic expectations on the rise of movement society. Citero, Friedhelm Neidhardt, Dieter Rucht in Berlin, that the decline of old-style political activity in political parties would be replaced by civil society, by social movement activity. Ulrich Beck, for example, spoke of superpolitics, subterranean politics, as the new main field of political action, and this was went along with the observation of the rise of a critical citizen, and by Dieter Klingemann, by Pippa Norris, Ronald Inglehart. There is a third strand which, in my understanding, is more realistic. It doesn't come with strong expectations, neither positive nor negative. These scholars observed the emergence of new forms of informal association and engagement, a new voluntarism, as it was called, and an increasing importance of unconventional political behavior. So there is already quite substantial evidence that changes in civil society are nothing but anything but new. And when I now, in my talk about civil society in transition, I don't just want to update the findings of that time, and I don't want to take sides with any of these scholars. I will argue that civil society is currently undergoing a new process of transition, and this is not only reinforcing and accelerating previous changes. We will find a lot of what has been said on the change in civil society nowadays too, but there are also new developments which need to be added to the picture. For example, the digitalization of civic engagement. And at the same time, we are observing that the old world of organized civil society is not simply dying out, but it is adapting to, well, some is dying out if you look at the party systems in Italy, for example, but nevertheless, most of these organizations have managed quite well in adapting to the new conditions, and the result of all this is that on the one hand, there are several old and new worlds of engagement emerging within civil society, and on the other, that the boundaries between civic engagement, between various forms of civic engagement and other individual and social activities are becoming increasingly blurred. And my argument is that both developments, the internal pluralization of civil society and the external dissolution of boundaries, will shape the new landscapes of civic engagement in the coming years. And the consequences of this transition are still unclear, and they seem to be rather ambiguous. Before I will provide some evidence on this, I think it's useful to first say a few words on what I mean by civil society, because there are quite different meanings, concepts on this. This is not the least due to the fact that civil society is known to be very diverse, and it cannot be equated less and less with the larger associations and social organizations that have shaped the history of West European countries in the past. And more importantly, it does not include political or charitable activities in the narrow sense. It certainly includes all types of leisure activities and leisure clubs. It ranges from leisure organizations, as you find it here, to social movements and to political protest. So I think it is important to keep this in mind. This diversity is one of the first characteristics of civil society. There is a minimal definition in the literature which I adopt. In this understanding, civil society is defined can be defined by voluntary associations of citizens beyond the state, the economy, and the private sector, namely the family. I think that's the standard minimal definition of civil society. And what is important here is, on the one hand, the voluntary nature of action, and on the other hand, the process of acting together. What Hannah Arendt called gemeinsames Handeln, acting together. This is the second, in my understanding, the second important element. You may add a third element, that is mutual help, gegenseitige Hilfe, in the meaning of Peter Kropotkin, which then leads us to solidarity as one of the cements of civil society. But let's stay with this minimal definition for the moment. Private voluntary associations, as Robert Putnam has put it. What is important is that civil society follows its own rationality. Whatever this rationality may be, and scholars have made some effort to identify it. Solidarity was a main candidate in this respect. But take a look at the sports clubs. In their case, solidarity doesn't play much of a role. So it's whatever this rationality, may be, it certainly differs from the profit and efficiency-oriented rationality of the economy and from the legal or bureaucratic rationality of the state. As a consequence, civil society's rationality of action, time and again, is in tension with both the economy, with companies, and with the state, with state bureaucracies. In our projects on civil society, the role of civil society groups in the refugee crisis, this became clear because the German democracy made a lot of effort to identify different subgroups of refugees with different entitlements on the basis of very specific criteria. This was their Aufenthaltserlaubnis, entitlements to stay, permissions to work, and all that stuff. For the civil society groups, these distinctions don't make any sense because for them, these were human beings, and they have. For them, it was imperative to help them, whatever their status, legal, bureaucratic status would be. And you can imagine that this has time and again produced conflicts between these initiatives and the bureaucracy. These different logics also make clear why it's difficult to instrumentalize and to integrate civil society into public activities. Civil society, in cases of emergency, is more than just a stopgap. Its function is not only to close gaps left by an overburdened state or by self-interested companies. Civic engagement offers the chance to do things differently. And it is exactly this quality of civil society, doing things differently, which is emphasized by the various progressive theories of societal change. They, of course, assume that making things differently also offers the possibility to do things better. However, even a band of robbers acts together, they mutually help each other, and membership is usually voluntary. But a civic association is not a band of robbers. At least we assume this. Therefore, we need some normative criteria to qualify civil society. And in the scholarly understanding of civil society strongly emphasizes the common good aspects of engagement for good reasons. However, as we all know, it's difficult to define the public good, and therefore it's difficult to clearly decide whether an organization really contributes to the production of a public good, whether it is gemeinnützig in the German vocabulary or not. We had this debate on attack in Germany, which is denied, which was denied the status of a civil society group, the status of Gemeinnützigkeit, because the courts argue it mainly its main activity are political activities. So but if we include political activities in our understanding of civil society, of course, this doesn't make too much sense. Another aspect that is being discussed in connection with civil society is the question of tolerance and civility of action. There is a consensus in the literature that violent action is not a form of civic engagement. But there are borderline cases and gray areas here too. Take national anti-colonial liberalization movements, for example. And currently there is a debate as to whether the activities of radical climate activists, new forms of civil disobedience, are still compatible with this civility. Whether it is still proper civic engagement to defile works of art and national monuments. In my view, we should not have too strong normative expectations on civil society. This does not do civil society justice, because we know that it can, of course, also have its dark sides. And we learned from Italian movies that we not only can have the good, the bad, and the ugly, but what is most important is that it's very difficult, if impossible, to distinguish the three. And this is exactly the same with civil society. This has been shown by the discussions on the question of whether queer thinkers, lateral thinkers belong to civil society, whether anti-immigration protests by Pegida in Germany are part of civil society. They're definitely part of the dark side of civil society, but they are part of civil society. Political protest in its various forms is part of civic engagement, and a democratic society is characterized by the fact that it allows and endures a plurality of interests, goals, and actors. It's the special quality of civil society. Also, part of its peculiar ambivalence, that it expresses the plurality of interests, values, goals, forms of action of a democratic society. What is exactly changing, if we speak of changes in civil society? In this regard, in recent decades, it has become fashionable to think of society in terms of systems and subsystems. In this case, I'm a bit outdated because I think more valuable for our understanding of civil society are earlier accounts of society, and I go back to Emil Durkheim and his conceptualization of an intermediary sphere between, on the one hand, the state and individual citizens. And this intermediary sphere encompasses the entirety of actors, organizations, and activities. Durkheim, in his famous book on the social division of labor, wrote, a nation can only be maintained if between the state and the individual there is a whole series of secondary groups that are close enough to the individual to attract them strongly in their sphere of activity and in this way draw them into the general stream of social life. Intermediary sphere, the secondary groups. Just imagine if they did not exist. A society continued, composed of an infinite number of organized individuals, which a hypertrophied state must suppress and contain, is a true sociological monstrosity. And the first 2 years of the corona pandemic, this is not a dystopia. The first 2 years of the corona pandemic, with the contact restrictions on activities of civil society actors, the bans on assembly in the public space and more, have given us a glimpse of such a monstrosity. They have given us an impression of what happens when the intermediate sphere of society is restricted and suppressed. The question, of course, then is how we can conceptualize this intermediary sphere. And here, Klaus Affe and Christine Fuchs developed a typology about 20 years ago in the context of a comparative research project organized by Robert Putnam. And they introduced two distinctions. The first is between the primary, the secondary, and tertiary groups. And the second distinction between formalized and non-formalized groups and activities. And here you can clearly see how families, kinship relationships are distinct from formal organizations, but also economic associations and firms as integrating forces of society. And you find the clans, the networks, the neighborhoods, and so on. In the post-war decades, I think for the formalized engagement in secondary associations formed the core of the intermediary sphere in West European societies. I don't want to go into the detail of this typology. I use it in the first place to formulate expectations on the transformation of civil society. And these transformations are by no means mutually exclusive. The first, of course, is a structural change in the intermediary sector by replacing one of the basic types by another. That is, primary associations have been replaced in the modernization process by secondary and tertiary associations. That's the conventional perspective of social modernization processes in the 19th century, but we can think of this as well. So modernization is one possibility. The second, of course, are changes from formalized to non-formalized groupings, that is, processes of informalization. And the third possibility is that the boundaries between the various categories become blurred, and that new hybrid forms will emerge that cannot easily be assigned. This would then be a type of hybridization. So modernization, informalization, hybridization can be basic types of change here. Why is the intermediary sector changing? I think here we can identify several factors. The first and the best known certainly are longer-term social modernization processes, individualization, value change, and so on. These processes have set in the 1960s, but their accelerating force, their modernization force, has been unfolding in particular in the past 20 years, I would think. Second, technological innovations, digitalization. David Soskais has reminded us to think of this in particular. Then political factors, political changes, regime changes, conflicts, constraints, opportunities. And finally, exogenous shocks, critical events and crises. the corona pandemic, the refugee crisis, the Ukraine war, to name only a few. All these factors taken together changed the motivation for engagement, they changed the conditions for engagement, and they changed the need for engagement. I will very briefly explain a few of them in more detail. I think social changes are of particular importance because they create new demands on civic engagement in some way. I think most important in this regard are Ulrich Beck's theory of individualization, which emphasizes the replacement of predetermined communities by new self-created and self-chosen associations. That's important. It's not a theory of individualistic behavior, but a theory of self-determination in newly formed associations. And this is very consistent with Ronald Inglehart theory of post-materialism, which argues that the value change in our society increases the desire for participation and self-realization. Finally, we find network theories of governance, which on the one hand emphasize the increasing importance of new forms of non-hierarchical integration, and on the other hand, the importance of organizational autonomy. If we take these three theoretical strands together, it becomes apparent that our societies have been confronted with new demands for new forms of participation and civic engagement based on self-realization and self-determination in non-hierarchical autonomous activities. These new demands create new potentials for civic engagement. But this does not mean that they must necessarily do so. There are also accounts which emphasize the increasing importance of individualistic behavior. In Germany, Andreas Reckwitz has made this argument very strong in recent years. So that there is a new individualism which does not associate, which does not collaborate and join action with others. In the book published by Reckwitz a couple of years ago, civil society is not even mentioned. Not only that it only plays a subordinate role, it's not even mentioned, because in his in the world in the new world he describes of singularity, Singularitäten, there is no place for groups for the group activities I just described. So these social changes are more ambiguous as we would assume by only reading Beck, Inglehart, and others. And of course, we learned meanwhile that individualization, even in Beck's understanding, can have its negative sides, because to determine, to choose your most preferable form of association and the creation of new associations also requires some capacity. Not all individuals do have the capacity to do this. So individualization can have its dark sides as well, its negative sides. And it's open whether it works out in one direction or the other. And these dark sides, by the way, these negative sides of individualization are one of the sources of the new populism. Very briefly on technological changes, important here again and well known by you is that digital technologies introduce structural changes in the public sphere. They create new opportunities for mobilization and participation, and most importantly, without organization. I think Nancy Pearlman grasped this quite nicely when she spoke of mobilizing from scratch. The new social movement which we observe, whether it's the Gilets jaunes or the Fridays for Future or Pegida, the Querdenker, the anti-vax, they have not been mobilized by existing organizations. On the contrary. These digital technologies, as some have observed, in particular create opportunities, new opportunities to activate younger people. We had a study in Germany on the consequences of digitalization on civil society, which emphasizes this point. So the incentives to activate, the possibilities to activate by digital technologies are unevenly distributed within society. But nevertheless, on balance, I would think that digital technologies make it easier to exploit the new potentials I just described for social participation. We realized, meanwhile, that civil society depends on political and legal preconditions that it cannot create itself. I think this is something quite important. There, in German constitutional law, you find the same, that the state depends on social preconditions, social and cultural preconditions, which it cannot create itself. So it's dependent on society and civic traditions in some way or the other. But the same holds for civil society. It's amazing that there is no trade-off between the state, no negative trade-off between state and civil society. Civil society is not strongest where the state is weak, but it is strongest where we have a strong state, as in the Scandinavian countries. If you look at at comparative data on the strengths of civil society and the strengths of the state, the welfare state, you find a combination of the two in Scandinavian countries. This reminds us that debates which emphasize a retreat of the state in favor of civil society maybe misses the point. What is important in this regard are, of course, the legal and political preconditions, and we observe since quite some time political interventions into civil society, which restrict the spaces for action for civil society. So there is a broad literature on the shrinking spaces, in particular in East European countries, but this not only holds for East European countries. Not to speak of those countries in which there is no are no possibilities for free assembly and to organize. At the same time, we observe pressures to expand the scope of the territorial scope of action of civil society as a consequence of European integration and transnationalization. Donatella has done a lot of work on this. The spaces in which civil society are operating are changing, they are shrinking, they are expanding, and some of them are replaced by virtual spaces. At the same time, we observe the emergence of a new policy field, engagement policy, in Germany, Engagementpolitik. That is, policies to systematically support the formation of civic engagement, of civil society groups, and their conditions to act. In Germany, this has been a main effort in the last 20 years. The most interesting example in this regard is one of the small Austrian federal states. In the northwest of Austria, Vorarlberg. I don't know the English translation. They are probably the first European state with a comprehensive, systematic public policy to support and activate civil society and their participation in public affairs at all levels. And finally, of course, there is something we could call the populist challenge to civil society. Of course, civil society is in many ways affected and confronted by the conflicts, the new cleavages that have been emerging. This, by the way, is a map which shows you the global scope of action of civil society, and only the green countries are those with more or less unrestricted spaces. You see they're in a minority. In some, there are only 3% of the world population which live in fully open, that is the dark green, fully open countries. Now let's come to the manifestations of change very briefly. There are quite a number of them. Among them is the informalization of civic activities, its individualization, something I call neo-traditionalization. We observe professionalization, the digitalization of activities, and the politicization of civic engagement. I will not describe all these manifestations in detail. Some of them are well known. The informalization of civic engagement has been observed since decades. There is ample evidence that formal organizations are losing importance in civil society. And the structural change in civil society that we have been observing includes the loss of importance of organizations such as political parties, trade unions, churches. We had the debate with Philipp Schmitter and David Soskais a couple of weeks ago. So the old pillars of the secondary sectors are certainly declining. But it would be, we cannot subsume all the new development in civic engagement under the term informalization. The second consequence of change is, in my understanding, is the individualization of engagement. That is not a trend towards individualistic behavior, but the individualization of engagement. It's not individualization, does not mean social isolation and egoism, but the individualization of helping in the sense of the development of new, more individual forms of commitment and engagement. Bo Rothstein years ago spoke of new forms of individualistic solidarity in the case of Sweden. In this understanding, the new volunteers are more individual, more autonomous, more self-determined, and less involved. These new forms of helping do not always have to be self-choosing. During the corona pandemic, they were also enforced by the government's contact restrictions, which did not allow people to engage with others in person. The significance of this form of the various new forms of helping can be illustrated by this typology, which combines two criteria. The first is who am I acting for? Am I acting for myself or for others? And with whom am I acting? Am I acting without others or with others? And of course, we can easily identify egocentric action, and we can also easily identify the conventional form of civic engagement in voluntary associations. But we also can identify two other activities which are coming of increasing importance. That is self-help groups on the one hand, and what I just mentioned, individualistic engagement without organization. There are plenty, with regard to the latter, there are plenty of examples of such forms of involvement. They may appear very trivial, but they nevertheless are important in my understanding. Such new forms of individualistic civic engagement starts with citizens planting flowers in public spaces, watering trees, or removing garbage in parks. They also include new forms of mentoring in school. In other words, citizens take responsibility for their public spaces and for public affairs on their own initiative. Exactly as de Tocqueville described this almost 200 years ago in the case of the US. And with the possibilities of digitalization, this kind of engagement can be organized and coordinated with others in a completely new way. There is also something I would call neo-traditionalization, that is the return or the reinforcement or the rediscovery of traditional forms of community, families and neighbors, which are becoming more, have been becoming more important in civic engagement. The recent crisis has shown that there is a great willingness to help among our population. However, it was also noticeable that the help was primarily provided by people in the immediate neighborhood to people whom you personally know. If you look at of recent surveys, there are several aspects that are interesting. The first is a study by Lima de Miranda and Snober shows an increase in solidarity in the course of the corona pandemic, but only within the national society, and not solidarity for the people in other countries. So the Germans were more solidaric within Germany, but not really solidaric for the Italians when they had a problem in March 2020. There was a great willingness to help, but as I just mentioned, it was families, friends, and neighbors who received this help. Only 50% of the people who are people which the helpers didn't know before. And supporting the argument on the limited importance of formally organized civil society, if you look at the figures, only 20% of the help came from these organizations. So it was definitely not the old organized form of civil society who was helping. But we should also not forget that there are solidarity gaps in our society. 10% of the respondents answered that they would have needed more help, but they didn't receive it. There are several manifestations of change with regard to the digitalization of civic engagement. I already mentioned participation without formal organization, the so-called mailing list, social groups. What is important is that digitalization of civic engagement, and I don't mean the technology, but the type of civic engagement, allows for new forms of low-threshold participation opportunities. So the entry barriers into engagement have been lowered by means of voluntary platforms, WhatsApp groups, and things like this. There are also new funding opportunities, new opportunities to mobilize funding, and of course there are various ways of facilitating engagement by means of digital technologies. They also, in a way, transformed the importance of places, because on the one hand, the place of residence has been weakening as a mean, and the workplace as well. Take the new forms of home office and things like this. So that's one thing, which means that ties to these places are losing in importance. But at the same time, and this is a good example of the ambiguities in these processes, we observe the emergence of new neighborhood networks, of digital neighborhoods. Politicization of civil society is also an important aspect. I think I don't need to talk on new protest movements here. They are well known, and they are an important part of this new mobilization. In particular, as I said, it's new protest movements, it's mobilization from scratch. It's not the old organizations. We have seen this in Germany quite well 2 years ago, when there were fears of a winter of discontent as a consequence of an increase of gas prices. And the old organizations, political parties, Die Linke, trade unions, and so on, were well prepared to mobilize. But these the demonstrations didn't receive much attention. So maybe there was a lot of discontent, but there was not a lot of mobilization. Not the least because it was apparent that existing organizations do not have the power to mobilize the new potentials which are maybe there and which had successfully been mobilized during the corona pandemic only a year or two before. And of course, civil society is also the object of cleavage politics. There is ample evidence that how the new cleavages materialize in civil society, of how they divide, but also how they activate civil society. But what is interesting is that it's not only the usual suspects which are prepared to be politically active anyway, are affected, but that associations which for a long time have been considered as being politically neutral or apolitical, sports clubs, now become the object of political demands, and they in some way have been put under pressure to respond and to politicize their self-understanding as well. Bayern München You know, this is a German soccer club. It's a good example because they have now an initiative against racism. So that's an important part of their activities. Let me come to the final part of my presentation: the consequences. Where does this lead us to? What does this mean for civil society? I remember the conversation David and Philip. David Soskais and Philip Schmitter had a couple of weeks ago when Philip had in mind the decline of civil society, the former civil society organizations on the one hand, and a subsequent loss of self-organizing capacity on the other hand. What does this mean for the capacity of civil society to act, to mobilize, to contribute to the production of common goods, to integrate society? First, I will deal with this briefly, step by step. I think the first factor we need to look at is civil society's capacity to activate and mobilize. And here the consequences are ambiguous. On the one hand, we observe a loss of membership of large organizations, trade unions. This is what Philip had in mind, a declining in voter turnout. But we at the same time observe high levels of new forms of civic engagement, less formal, more flexible, more project-oriented, and we observe new forms of activation, of communication, and of networking. So on balance, I would think the potential to activate and mobilize civil society has not been shrinking, but it need to be activated in different ways. But what about the self-organizing capacity? Philip complained about the decline of economic self-organizing, and thinking back to the good old days of corporatism, of course, the role of economic business associations to self-organize the economy and to have a self-organizing influence in society has certainly been declining. But the recent crisis has also revealed a remarkable potential of societal self-organizing capacity. The refugee crisis in particular. In Germany, we had a new movement of volunteers. About 5 million of citizens were active in these activities in the years 2015 and the following. So this was enormous. I'm a bit more skeptical when it comes to the integrative capacity of civil society, because we observe a declining integrative force of associations, not only to integrate their own membership, but also to integrate society at large. So what Robert Putnam called the bridging social capital in some way has been declining. Loose networks don't have the same integrative power as the old formal organizations had. We also should not forget that social capital, that is, the capacity for civic engagement, the individual capacity for civic engagement is unequally distributed. In Germany, we learned that it is lower in the east of Germany than in the west, that it is lower in areas with high unemployment than in the more prosperous regions, for example, and that it is lower in the migrant communities than in other communities. So if you take this together, it's quite evident that social capital, that even if social capital is, there is a substantial amount of social capital, it is evenly distributed and it's systematically, there's certain groups in society who systematically suffer from a loss of social capital. And finally, with regard to the integrative capacity, the new divides and polarizations by the new conflicts, the new cleavages, the rise of populism definitely put the integrative capacity of society, of civil society, under pressure. I'm done. I don't need the 5 minutes. So if we take these three points together, it's quite evident that we should not be too optimistic with regard to the integrative capacity of civil society. Let me conclude. What does all this mean? I hope that I managed to convince you that civil society is right in the middle of a process of transformative change. And the special feature of this process is the fact that these developments are all taking place more or less simultaneously, not necessarily in parallel, but simultaneously, interacting with each other, hindering and accelerating each other, and working together to drive the development of civil society. It's how these interaction effects that are important. All these developments and all these manifestations contribute to the emergence of a new landscape of civic engagement, a new image of civil society, and they will shape this landscape in the future. There is no tendency in one direction or the other. It's the simultaneity and the diversity of forms of action and association that will shape the landscape of civic engagement in the future. Because of this, we should assume that this change is not only irreversible. Above all, we should also expect that the development of civil society has become unpredictable. At present, we see a very contradictory, a very open, and a very diverse picture of the new landscape of civil society. Further development can go in all directions. It can bring about new forms of solidarity and commitment, but it can also identify social conflicts and weaken social cohesion. Civil society is becoming more diverse and more unpredictable. The only thing that is clear to me is that there is no way back to the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar, for these broad and very systematic reflections that I'm sure will be very relevant for us. I'm happy you didn't imitate Bourdieu, but I'm curious about the title of your other presentation on hypocritical Europe, and we hope to have you next year again to present this other paper. We have two discussants, Hans-Jörg Trenz and Cesar Guzman. I expect Hans-Jörg to be more oriented. Do you want?
Yes, I can do this, and it is indeed true that I will be more theoretical because I have been struggling with the notion of civil society myself for some time, and I definitely have to say something about how to conceptualize civil society. But I also would like to comment on the transformation of civil society. So civil society, from my understanding, needs to be conceptualized as a notion of normative political theory. And I have always sustained that civil society cannot be defined without making normative references. And this means also, if we talk about civil society in transition, we need to look at changes of normative views about what role civil society plays in democracy. So we observe then basically democracy in transition. And so with civil society or through civil society, we observe transitions of democracy. This is inseparable. And this runs, in my opinion, against some formal definitions that are quite popular in political science. You were referring to some of these formal definitions in your talk. So a civil society is certainly not just political participation. Sometimes it is defined as the participatory realm, but this is insufficient because also political parties and elections are about participation. We would say that civil society has to do with some form of engagement that goes beyond, for instance, voting in elections. But this also means that not all forms of political engagement belongs to civil society. So we would usually be quite hesitant to call, for instance, lobbying for private interests as belonging to civil society. So it is also not political engagement, but it is a form of civic engagement. Which means in turn then that civil society is simply defined by the notion of civic or the civil. And we need to have some idea what civic or civil means. And only through this understanding of what civic is, we can identify and also locate civil society. First question here would be, what is civil or civic in civil society? And if a civic then defines what civil society is about, it follows then, theoretically speaking, that civil society is not defined as a particular activity, a political realm, but it is a form of content. So we could also say civil society is defined as a form of discourse. Civil society must have a discursive form. And it is a discursive form that applies to a particular form then of political action indeed. And if you look at common definitions that take the normative element in, indeed, you find some definitions that take this seriously. And we call civic then a particular type of action. And you find this in definitions that you also mentioned that need to be driven by mutual respect, by the recognition of equality, and the notion of the public good that is defined in terms of global justice. So the public good orientation here indeed is crucial. And I would even say it's a necessary element to define civil society. And I find definitions that relate to civil society as a form of activism simply insufficient here. For instance, free associations or definitions that rely on types of actors like civic associations or citizens. Citizens can voluntarily engage in all kinds of political activities, but we need to have a normative, strong notion here of what is civic to draw a distinction here between civic and uncivic. And to categorize then actors as civic or uncivic and locate them as official members of civil society, I don't think that this is something we can do in political science. The political struggle, it's an ongoing political struggle, and it is open to all kinds of actors. So claiming to belong to civil society then is actually part of a political struggle about the meaning of civic. And I would claim that all kinds of actors can claim to be civic, and they do it all the time. So if the Pope, for instance, in the Vatican defends peace or a notion of the public good in a fight for climate change, I would say the Pope is part of civil society discourse. And even voluntarily so, if he does so. And So these official classifications of civil society, I find them suspicious. We were mentioning in Germany that the court decided that ATTAC does not belong to civil society. It should not have the status of civil society. I would find this rather suspicious. Also because it underlies a notion of civic, like common good activities that should not be political, which is very dubious in my opinion. So they claim that political forms of activism are partisan and therefore should not be part of civil society. So I don't think that this is a sustainable way to define civil society. Civil society is defined by an ongoing struggle about the notion of the civic, and we as academics engaging in normative political theory might contribute to this as the Pope in Rome contributes to this. So if you look then at the historical development of civil society, and we wish to understand the transformation of civil society, I think we cannot do without another concept that you did not mention, but I think it is important. And this is a quite controversial concept. It's the concept of learning. Civil society relates to forms of democratic learning, and this is quite obvious in the case of the Federal Republic of Germany, where civil society was meant to become more civic over time and to educate the democratic citizens, which is at the same time a learning to engage with the public good, and the idea that civil society facilitates some form of democratic learning. And this now might be empirically completely wrong. As a matter of fact, we have lots of, if you try to understand this empirically, we always end up with surveys that show that there is no democratic learning, or that it is at least very hard to prove empirically that there are such forms of democratic learning. But I think this is not the point here. The point is that the idea of learning is a powerful idea that drives civil society. And as such, I think it becomes even more relevant nowadays. You can see this in many debates, how civil society is brought in. For instance, in migration debates, the idea is that migrants, to integrate, should become a part of a civil society, which means they should become democratic citizens. So migrants should go through a process of democratic learning. You also see this in debates of climate justice movements, which are related to strong ideas of democratic education. There is a very strong form of moral obligation that is related to becoming a member of civil society. And this moral obligation, in my opinion, has become even more strong. And this is definitely a transition of civil society that we can observe, that it is emphasizes very much these forms of civic engagement related to very strong forms of moral obligations. And this, some people would claim that these strong moral commitments that nowadays are related to civil society become even constraining to some degree, or paternalistic or even authoritarian, one could call this. So the question arises here, how much morally committing civil society can be actually in a democracy? And I think the climate change movement very much struggling with this problem. So what is changing? What is currently transforming? I think in your presentation you made quite a clever move here, because you said that not necessarily civil society is changing, but you were emphasizing the intermediary sphere. Quite useful as a contribution to understand current transformation. So we need to understand an ongoing structural transformation of the intermediary realm, which involves then, of course, formal and informal associations. And I would add here, it also involves the communicative infrastructure. The new ways to interrelate through social media, this is definitely dramatically changing with deep impact. And this would be, I think, wrongly understood to be simply technology-driven, as implied in the form of digitalization of civil society, for instance. It relates, in my opinion, to new forms of socialization, and I think you were also emphasizing this in your talk, to new forms of political mobilization. So what is important for civil society research here is whether this structural transformation of associational forms or forms of political mobilization goes hand in hand with the value change. Because only a value change, in my opinion, would indicate that there is a change of the core meaning of civil society. So changes of organizational forms do not necessarily indicate a change of the very notion of civil society. This would be my point. They do not necessarily, for instance, challenge the distinction between civic and uncivic. And my impression is, you might have a better overview here, but I think that there is no clear indication for such a value change. For instance, you make reference to Reckwit's idea of a singularization, which describes changes in the forms of socialization, but not necessarily an underlying value change. So, and you mentioned this then also, that there might be new demands for civil society. Demands are very important to understand in what direction the transition of civil society is going. If there are new demands for civil society, this means that there are new demands for identifying the public good, for drawing a distinction between civic and uncivic. For instance, in the struggle against populism, in the struggle for climate change, or during the COVID-19 pandemic. If these new demands exist, if we can agree on this, then this would precisely mean that there is a search for a democratic response to the challenge of what we call, for instance, a post-democracy. Civil society then is the antidote against what sometimes is identified as a tendency towards post-democracy or disrupted communications on social or populism. Civil society then is, there is a new demand for civil society, or there's even a high demand for civil society, precisely because we are facing these challenges of the transformation of the communicative infrastructures of democracy. But I would claim that the normative core then of civil society remains exact.
Hans-Jörg and Cesar?
Well, it's a difficult task that has been assigned to me to comment on this presentation. I will just exchange with you some impressions and probably open questions to the author. I think that, the presentation in a way makes clear that civil society is a fuzzy concept that exists only in interaction, only when we conceive of civil society in interaction with other spheres. So there is no way to think about civil society without confronting and putting in perspective also the sphere of the market and the economy and the sphere of politics. So I think that in a way the tension between these three theoretical spaces, we might say, is what constitutes the civil society. So if we assume that it's this interaction what constitutes civil society, therefore it follows that changes in the sphere of the market or the economy, as well as changes in politics, will yield transformations in the civil society as well. But the question remains as to what civil society specifically. It's a space. Is the space what is left outside the market and the state? Or it's an overlapping of properties. In a similar way, we can also, from the presentation, observe that civil society could be seen as a feeling of belonging. I mean, I'm an individual. I might be the owner of a private company, but at the same time, I belong to reference groups. I have certain values. I aspire to, I have a horizon in terms of what I like in society, what I expect from society, and it positions individuals in this intermediate space, which we call a civil society. So it's a feeling. It would be a feeling of in which individuals self-position themselves. The other aspect that caught my attention when hearing the presentation is that it made me remind these old discussions in sociology regarding the very definition of society or the social, What's the social, which would be the essence of the sociological discipline, by contrast to political science or, economy, etc. And it also made me it reminds me of Jeffrey's Alexander concept of civil sphere, which, interestingly, you didn't mention in your presentation. And I think that it's Alexander and others in that school of thought have made significant developments in thinking civil society and civil sphere as this space that cannot be explained only by power relations, politics, nor by self-interest, the economy. So the core of the presentation is basically that there is an undergoing significant change in the constitution of civil society in Western societies. My question is, to what extent I think that we can agree that there are several signs that you have described in your presentation. There are several signs of transformation, but the question is, one of the questions that might arise is, to what extent this change is unprecedented and marks a new phase in social development. And I might be, or I might play a little bit the contrarian here by saying that I have my doubts that this change might be, while I recognize that we are undergoing a process of transformation, I wonder to what extent these transformations are specific of the current period, of this present time, or whether these are ongoing transformations that pertain, that we have also identified probably 150 years ago as a developing ongoing process. For example, political actors, political parties still recruit politicians and personnel from civil society. Civil society's organizations still are a reference point for parties in their competition for power. Also because politicians and parties need to engage with civil society in terms of not only for building a social base or a recruitment base, but also because they need to persuade people and they need to engage in narratives and values, make them resonate with what is going on in the civil society. So this is one thing that I would say it's still a common feature, a continuity that we might observe. The other thing is that I was thinking you were mentioning that processes of individualization, probably also secularization of society as the driving forces of this transformation. But on the other hand, we can also observe a comeback of religion in society. This is not only something that is happening in the global south, it's also something that we can observe in so-called Western societies, no? And this new form of religiosity also entails forms of conviviality and aggregation. And a final or a couple of final reflections in this line of thinking in terms of what is unprecedented or new in this ongoing process of transformation. What's the connection of civil society with the concept of subsidiarity, which is a key, also it's a crucial development, also in political, I mean, it's a crucial concept in the ideology of very powerful political parties, no? From all ideological strands. It also, and this is my final comment, you mentioned something that I think that it's very important. It's that there is a politicization of civil society, you know, which also suggests that civil society, it's a politically charged concept. It's an ideologically charged concept. So its fascination it not only stems from the fact that it's difficult to locate the singularity of civil society without confronting it with the market and politics, but it also stems from the fact that civil society, it's a politically charged and ideologically charged concept, no? And might be used, and is being currently used as a tool of legitimation of political discourses and political programs, no? So my final reflection would be, while we, in sociology, I'm speaking as a sociologist here, while in sociology we really, I mean, we actually need the concept of civil society, it's our object of study, and without it, we cannot exist as a discipline, almost. On the other hand, it's fuzzy, and it's being it in itself a political tool. It becomes difficult, therefore, for us not to think exclusively of civil society in terms of an analytical category, right? So I would leave it there. Thank you.
These are very deep questions. Since we have to finish at 1 o'clock sharp, because there is another meeting in this room, I just wanted to open the floor for no more than 10 minutes in order to give also 10 final minutes for addressing the questions.
May I only respond to one of the points very briefly? That's, of course, on definition, conceptualization. What is civil society? I try to be brief in my presentation on this because I, in some way or the other, assumed that there is some common understanding here, and I realized from the two comments, definitely not. In my manuscript, I have a very small paragraph which I left out, and I now read it. In all of this, however, it must be borne in mind that the struggle for concepts is always a struggle for the inclusion or exclusion of certain groups, of certain interests in a political field of action. These conflicts of recognition, inclusion, demarcation, and exclusion have accompanied the history of political movements, and they have characterized the current debate on civil society in the last 20 years. At the heart of these controversies are, of course, familiar questions. Should civil society be represented in public institutions, committees, by whom, who should have seats in commissions, who should have access to public funding? This should remind us that questions of definition are always questions of power too. And As a conclusion, as a social scientist, we should first of all be cautious in taking over terms and concepts from our field of study. And second, we should not have too strong normative expectations on civil society. Civil society is not only an actor, but also a field of controversy, a battleground.
You have Jonathan, Mario. I put myself close to it.
Thanks. Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm also a visiting scholar here. I want to, I mean, it in a way follows well from the passage you read out, because I want to ask you to say more about how you understand the consequences or implications of your analysis for the policy-making process. So, I mean, I don't think you have to be a corporatist in the sense of Philippe Schmitter, or a strong believer in the mediating role of political parties, which I think is widely agreed to have declined in the past couple of generations, to think that nonetheless, to have an impact on the policy process in an ongoing way, there are some questions that arise from. I took the main thrust of what you said, despite all the ambiguities and contradictory tendencies, to be informalization and individualization of civic engagement being the dominant trend. But if we want to think about how, let's say, groups of citizens who are not political parties, maybe also not trade unions and employers associations, can influence the policy process, then some capacity for ongoing dialogue and decision-making vis-a-vis public authority seems very important. And then we get the concept of public interest advocacy groups, who also like to call themselves civil society organizations. And we see, I would say, especially in the European Union, in transnational governance, but also in national and local governance, that public support for civic engagement is often bringing these groups into the policy-making process. So maybe you can say a little bit more about how your analysis fits with that trend. Does it fundamentally undermine it? I mean, maybe if we look at France today, we can see what happens if that capacity starts to collapse, so that you have just a series of conflictual engagements between all kinds of civic and interest groups and the state or the political process.
Thank you, Edgar. I like a lot your comprehensive presentation, and I think it's a very good framework where we can put different types of approaches. I think Hans-Jörg perhaps has some normative overtones on the concept that can be interesting at a more specific level of. Let me put some political economy elements as a context. Basically, we have a period of neoliberalism, which is driving many of these trends that you have been discussing. Clearly, individualization in its more extreme form, and professionalization on the other hand, for the replacement of public activities and divisions. And we are also living in a period of extreme inequalities. We are compared to a context where civil society studies started, when in the context of strong welfare states, strong sense of national communities and so on, we are now experiencing a lot of structural transformation in society driven by these two elements. So I would like to ask what you think about this neoliberal and inequality context. Finally, we had a great discussion at the Pizzorno conference on the issue of collective identities. And my question is civil society, and under which condition, in your view, capable of reconstructing to some degree some collective identities as an element, both a condition but also an outcome of engagement?
Bella, and then I close.
Just briefly, perhaps there is time to think about that, to talk about that. Now, I'm still struggling with the point of conceptualizing the backlash form of civil society. So partly you already gave to us some indication in the second slide where you defined different types of civil society, and you call them dark sides, which I agree with. But at the same time, if I have to think about the necessity, the analytical necessity to link the second slide and the first slide, in which we think about the roles or possible functions of this civil society concept, you mentioned 2 points. One can be the subject of change, but then within the parentheses there were driving forces of progressive societal transformation. And the second is the object of change. So I of course, it goes without saying that all the presentation was extremely fascinating and useful. But I'm still struggling to consider, how to consider this part of civil societies. Also because, as also Mario now mentioned, but before you mentioned ecologism, currently these civil society groups are taking position on the one hand on environmental policies, not as denialists anymore, and on the other hand, they are also part of the process coming back from, coming up from neoliberal transformations, no? And not anymore on cultural issues. So the point, not anymore just on cultural issues. So the point is how we have to consider.
Thank you. I just add 2 points, 2 questions. One is hybridizations and de-hybridizations, because what we saw is that on the one hand, you have, because of processes of criminalizations, even more than shrinking of spaces, more connections between social movement forms, politizations that you mentioned. We also noted type of disruptive forms of actions. But at the same time, we also, I'm looking at Stella because we work together at part of a research on international civil society organizations working against the patents on vaccinations. And there, for instance, what seems to be the case is extreme forms of, can I say, taming, integrations within international organizations, or at least attempt to be integrated, with cutting ties instead with social movements, broader basis. So I think this could also be interesting, and I agree with your multifarious type of expectations about changes. The other thing is about what was at the basis of the transformations during all this crisis. And what we saw in another project on participating and communicating in pandemic time in Tuscany, so more at the local level, is that one driving element is the changing constituency. So the fact that there is a broader group of people in needs, and that this has transformed not only the visions by the organizations themselves, but also the visions by others of the organization. So that the type of constituency is also important, as we see it, for instance, nowadays, if comparing solidarity with Ukrainians, with solidarity with Palestinians, that the type of interactions with state institutions is totally different. From integration in support to criminalization. Times to answer, so I stop here.
That's good. I take your remarks as a comment and some empirical illustration of trends I mentioned. In fact, I can nicely integrate them into the picture. I see the spots where they fit in. Let me begin with a comment on Cesar Guzman's point. Is the change unprecedented? Here I would insist that it is. Here I'm very much inspired by the theories of late modernity, reflexive modernization, sociological theories on which we've been working on in Munich in the 2000s, which I think have shown quite convincingly that there is a structural transition of industrial society. What I have been describing now for the case of civil society are the manifestations of this process of transition in a specific part of society and for specific forms of social organization and specific social activities. I would emphasize that civil society in late modernity is different from the civil society in early modernity and in industrial modernity. This does not mean that there are not lines of continuity. Even structural changes do not mean fundamental disruptions where anything changes, but they would definitely mean that the basic institutions, the basic structures of these fields and these activities follow a different logic. I think that's in a way the presumption of my analysis and of my argument. The consequence is, and this brings me to Jonathan Zeitlin's point, the consequences is that from a policy-making perspective, civil society has become ambiguous. On the one hand, there is, as I have emphasized in my introductory statement, there is an increasing demand for the inclusion of civil society in the more demanding forms of governance. The more demanding public policies are, the more important the contribution of civil society in whatever form is. However, we cannot take for granted that civil society, that the changes I have shown in civil society will allow it to perform the very functions effectively, if at all. This leads to an important conclusion, namely that civil society needs to be the object of public policies. This is what I described with the political preconditions of civic engagement. And I once again point to Vorarlberg. There is meanwhile a remarkable knowledge on how you can positively intervene into civil society. On the one hand, to stabilize the eroding old forms of civil society organization, and on the other hand, of course, to make the more fluid forms of participation more stable, more reliable. I think this should, for the coming years, policies to support civil society should be on top of the agenda. If we want civil society to play the role we expect it to be. We can't take for granted that this is a resource that is easily available whenever we need it, and which we can ignore and neglect when the demand is lower. I've been working on a government commission in Baden-Württemberg a few years ago, in which we tried to work on concepts how to stabilize, how to support civil society, how to, for example, establish new infrastructures to support civic engagement. This is important. The economic. I was well aware when I prepared the presentation, and after having participated in previous talks here, thought, where's the economy? The economy is left out. This does not mean that it doesn't play a role. It comes into play not as a direct effect, but indirectly, because it in many ways shapes the social modernization processes which I mentioned. The way individualization works out, whether it produces a kind of atomization, that is, people who, or it affects the capacity of individuals to reconnect. It disconnects these processes, and economic neoliberalism is part of this. It disconnects people from their existing associations, boundaries, affiliations. And then the capacity to disconnect, to reconnect becomes important. And here, social inequality plays an important role. As I mentioned, if I look at the distribution of civic engagement in Germany, apparently regions with higher unemployment, civic engagement is lower. That is, social inequality has an enormous effect on the capacity, the individual capacity to participate and to engage. And for this reason, of course, economic disparities are an important precondition when it comes to the future role of civil society. So this is important. I think I should introduce this at some point in the presentation, and the same holds for collective identities. I know it's cheap to emphasize that I didn't completely forget this, because when I attended the Pizzano conference, it immediately came to my mind that collective identities play a role here, and they definitely. They would have been the last aspect in the last in the last factor when it comes to social integration. What about the capacity of this new civil society to produce collective collective identities. Can we expect these loose? We talked about this before my talk. Can we expect these loose associations, these loose networks, to have the same capacity to create new collective identities than the old one? I'm not a normative theorist, so I wouldn't for me, the educational aspect Trenz mentioned is not that clear. We can also observe radicalization. So there are developments, not necessarily positive learning, collective, but nevertheless the building of collective identity, of new collective identities, would be an important part of such learning. Of such learning processes. This is also an open question, one of the open questions where we simply cannot assume that civil society will live up to our expectations, advanced normative expectations in particular. I'm more modest in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is a clear need to have you back in Florence another time to continue the discussion. For the moment, thank you very much to you, to Hans-Jörg, Cesar, and to the public who participated.